Fireball or I actually, yeah, let's keep on looking. So I am going to I did not Congratulations.
She'll come back.
Yeah, cool. All right. We'll talk more about that.
Yeah. It's neat. And it's interesting to see how.
Yeah, I'm very fortunate. Under one umbrella, everyone takes their own.
Yeah.
They're very
Well, that's true. So I try to.
They're very
motivation.
I think that's a good idea.
Yeah. They still are.
You might as well spend another week because
It was everything was
No, seriously, no, it's last month.
Yes, let's keep someone that can.
Exactly. A little bit.
I'm serious.
Hi. I love it.
Mine right here.
I'm going to play with that.
A sword?
Yeah, so that's a sword.
Yeah, you got one.
All right, sword.
That's to defend your
Just a couple more minutes to get everybody settled in place before we get going. So if you don't have food, we'll grab something now. It's time to grab something.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Now, Trevor and I will get you back to levels, but the fact that you're really good power.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm sure the council would
Testing
1, 2. Yeah.
Well, we should talk, you'd ask about whether I want the purple.
Right, and that would be very good.
Okay.
Well, I know, but I'm just saying, this is not a true unionized situation.
Yeah.
I wrote back on the message.
I know you think someone's gonna be.
Let me go ahead and get us started. Thank you all for being here for Jenny Hoz's defense of her doctoral dissertation. I am not going to take any thunder away from the from her presentation by talking about the dissertation at all or talking about the research. But I do want to just briefly say a couple things. First, thank the committee for being here, and the committee's all aligned on the front row, which is not normal, actually, for this kind of event. But she strong-armed everybody. Get some food. If you need to get something else or want to get something else, even after we get started, I don't think anyone might just stand up and grab something. If you haven't turned off your phone, there is not service up here, but please turn your phone off anyway, just in case a 4G happens to sneak in somewhere. There is public wireless if you need that. And the restrooms on this floor are actually just around the corner here, if you need those as we go. What this will look like is there'll be about 1 hour roughly here for the public part of the event. Jenny has prepared a 15-minute presentation. 45-minute presentation, roughly. That
I can do 15 minutes. I don't have no problem.
that covers the salient part of the study. There will be time, hopefully at the end of that, for a public question and answer before we ask everybody who's not part of the committee to step out of this room for the closed door session. Again, thank you all for being here and supporting Jenny. Jenny has been one of the most outstanding students I could have ever asked for. I've had almost 40 students since I came to Oregon State University, graduate students in 2004. And Jenny is a real standout, both in terms of her approach, as well as I think the seriousness of her framework and her commitment to her work and her framework, as well as just the kind of person that she is. I mean, all of you are here partially because of that, both on the committee and the audience. So thank you all again for being here to support Jenny, and I'm going to turn it over to you. I left my computer at home in the mad dash to get out of the house, so I will be taking notes on my phone. No, I am not texting people. So thank you.
Thank you, Sean. That's very kind. And I pay him to say all those kind things. So, did I do something very good? So thank you all for being here. Gracias por estar aquí. Actually, right now, I'm so tired. I'm so tired and frazzled and I'm overwhelmed. So I apologize if I cry. I want to say hi to my mother, my sister, and my friends who are in the internet checking this out. So this is a very long journey for me. Lynn knows this because Lynn met me along this journey, and it was her who motivated me to come here and actually pursue this. This journey began a long time ago in New Jersey. Colombia originally, and then we moved to New Jersey. And here I am on the right, my sister's there, in this little apartment building. And this is one of the biggest snowfalls we saw back at the time, and it's made a real impact on me. But there wasn't a lot of nature and a lot of environment around me. The way I fell in love with nature, and is going to totally date me, is through television, watching Jack Cousteau on TV. Particularly, I remember when I was little, I would watch when I saw river dolphins in the Amazon. That's when it did it. Like, I remember going, you know, that's the life for me. I'm going to go there and look at these animals firsthand. That hasn't happened yet, but I'm not going to completely rule it out. I've had amazing interactions with other animals in the world, and so I've been very, very fortunate. But this is where my love began for the environment. And so many, many years later, I meandered my way to a job at the aquarium in California, a little small aquarium, not well known. And I started looking around, and I started realizing that there weren't a lot of people like me. And I was like, hey, what happened? So it kind of prompted me to start creating programs where I would invite people that look like me and give them those opportunities. And in particular here is, this is a Young Women in Science program. Kim Swan, you're over there. This particular program is bilingual, bicultural program for young women who really explore being scientists. And this was one of the programs that actually Lynn and I, this is one of the ones we interacted over. But I wanted to find out, well, what is it? Was I just unique? I don't think so. I think there have to be other people like me doing this kind of work. And so, sure enough, there are other people doing this work. Recently, a research study came out. They said, yes, there are people of color in the environmental movement, but not many. In fact, while people of color make up 36% of the U.S. population, only 20 and 29% make up science and engineering workforce. only 16% of them make up the environmental organizations. So what that looks like at different organizations, environmental organizations, is that there are a small percentage, and this is all people of color, a small percentage in large environmental work. I'm like, well, what's going on here? Why is it that there's only a few of us doing this kind of work? So I kept asking, why are there not more people like me? And honestly, that is what brought me here to my PhD program. I talked to a lot of people along the way, and I wanted to find out, what is it about my experience that was unique, different, or that could be similar to other people's? So throughout my dissertation, these were the guiding questions that I kept asking myself. Well, what's kind of research? Why are Latinos, are they involved with the environment? Do they have an environmental identity? Where are they with that? What are the factors that are similar? If other Latinos are in the whole environmental movement, are there similarities between me and them? And if they're not, then what are the differences? And do Latinos have an environmental identity? I wanted to see if what we knew about them could be measured. So before I continue any further, I should say that the term Latino right now I'm using kind of as a long, big term to encompass all of these other nomenclatures. The term Latino, Hispanic, and of course when you talk about countries of origin, are all names of people who identify, that I'm identifying as Latino as part of this research study. There is a whole history about the way that it works, but for my dissertation, I used the term Latina, Latino, but for this presentation, you'll hear me say Latino just for ease of communication. But I'm representing all of these types of nomenclature when I refer to them. So, as I came to do my PhD, there were emerging themes that came throughout. And these I'm going to talk about individually, but these are the ones that really stood out for me throughout my work and eventually came out in my dissertation. So, identity is something that the way you see yourself in relation to others. How do people respond to you? How do you respond to them? How do you respond in relation to the way that they perceive you? And environmental identity is just a portion of that. But it's the way that you relate to the natural world and how you then behave on that. And so what we know from environmental identity that different research has shown is that it can prescribe thought. So you can take global issues and make them, personalize them into your everyday life. It also can prescribe actions that are compatible with the sense of who you think you are and what you feel empowered to do. And it can also prescribe your behavior. So there's research that shows if you believe yourself an environmentalist, you're probably going to have more pro-environmental behavior as part of that. As part of this whole personal narrative, as I started getting into the environmental field, I realized one of the first things that we did is we sit around the table and like, so how'd you get into this field? And like, there was one time there was this bear and this, these great stories about the environmental field, and I'd be like, I watch Gusto on TV, But the personal narrative is a very important part of this whole aspect of environmentalism, and particularly the research that's been done about it, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later, is around significant life experiences. But essentially, it's these milestone moments where you see yourself connected to this larger environmental narrative. And it's important for me, as I was a researcher, I thought it was important because it also situated them culturally and socially. So what was going on around them that created this opportunity, these experiences for them to connect to the environment. The final thing that really emerged for me, and is something that has really resonated, and I'm starting to do work up in the Portland metro area that I'm starting to really see this, is intersectionality. And essentially, intersectionality is different aspects of your identity, and these are just a few of them. There's so many different ways of looking at yourself that overlap. And those all eventually come together. Some identities supersede others. Some will detract from others, some will add to others, some are compounding. It all depends on the way that you see yourself. And so intersectionality is a very big aspect of the Latino experience in this country, because it's not just about being an immigrant or a fifth-generation Latino, but there's aspects of power and privilege as part of that whole intersection. Intersectionality for me then, when I was realizing that the work was coming from that, really helped me find the type of critical framework that I wanted to use for my work. And so I eventually decided to settle on a Latino critical race theory, or LatCrit is often the way it's referred to. And I just wanted to give you a genealogy of where it came from. Essentially, these are theories that were looking at the dominant worldview and criticizing it, giving it a critical perspective. And out of that came critical race theory, which then had other offshoots focused on individual populations, and LatCrit was one of them. LatCrit theory has many tenets to it, most of which I'll be talking about, but I really focused on just quite a few. There's so many aspects to this theory that I think it's still building. It's a relatively new field, new theory, and we're still really trying to get a voice around some of these experiences. But intersectionality happens to be one of the biggest aspects of LatCrit theory. So the way I went around, kind of going back to answering my questions, I conducted these 3 parts to my dissertation. A lit review, I interviewed Latino environmental professionals, and then I also wanted to survey non-environmental professional Latinos that lived in the Pacific Northwest to find out about their environmental identity. So the first part I just want to do is talk about what I found in the lit review. What is the current research on Latinos and the environment? When I first started doing this research, and I remember looking through it, I started thinking there really isn't a lot of work there. In fact, even interviewing the people that I talked about, when we talked, like, there's no research out there about Latinos in the environment. Yeah, there's nothing there. Well, using LatCrit theory, particularly these aspects or these tenets of it, I discovered actually there is quite a wealth of information on Latinos in the environment, much to my surprise. And it really came around the way that we identify ourselves, and that's what's keeping this information so spread apart. I came across this paper by Devan Pena, and he had done a lit review of research between 1985 to 2003, and you found that there were these clusters of research terms by which the research was gathered. So there was information on land grant use in the New Mexico area, rural colonia, which are populations that border both the Mexican and American side, US side, farm workers. So these were the terms that he was using and finding that he was clustering the research in that. By using those terms, and then using all these other ethnic terms that we've identified as possible ways that Latinos identify, or the terms that they use, and adding to it the environment and this new field of research called sense of places, also around this whole aspect of nature and connecting with the natural environment, I was able to finally coalesce to finding 39 research articles that were able to speak about this whole idea. And I was wondering, well, why is that the case? Well, if you look here, and this is an overlay of rural counties, which are in green, versus urban communities, and you overlay that with the Latino community, and these are where higher numbers of Latino community, you'll see that there is no one Latino experience. It's varied, it's different, and the way they interact with the environment is going to, of course, be completely different. So, with that in mind, I finally put the research together, and I kind of put it in these silos because I realized that this is what was happening. Essentially, there was research that was geographically based, and those were the research that was based in the West and Southwest, and also in political territories. Political territories I'm identifying primarily as Puerto Rico, but it's also places such as Guam, where maybe Latinos have had a historical presence before. And that's what this is the difference between this literature and that literature. This literature has strong historical ties. So some of these Latinos that are here have actually been here before the United States was even in place. But they're sometimes viewed as foreigners, when in actuality, they're the originals, right? So there's a geographically based literature. Then there's location-based, the difference between an urban versus rural communities. So you have people that live in Chicago versus people that are in the middle of Ohio, for example. And then you have non-peer review, which if you go and start doing research in and looking for Latinos in the environment, that's the predominant amount of research. You think that's the only research available. But there's, like I said, much more. So quickly, just to go over each of the sections, the West and Southwest, I put them together because essentially it's really talking about this connection to land, this ancient connection, spiritual connection to land, and how that land was taken away from them in different ways, whether it was they came up to the Bracero movement, or they actually were here when they were the conquistadors. They all get lumped in together, and the same kind of oppression is seen. And they're victim and oppressors. This woman, Zentella, created this model of Hispano attachment, which it really credits to the people in New Mexico, but I think can actually take a broader perspective to even those living in the West, which really talks about the way that they connect to the environment. And that is La Tierra es Madre, meaning that they really feel a spiritual connection to the land. There's something really deep and meaningful. And there's a family feel to the environment. And as Madre, she talks about the way that colonization has taken away land and power from them. And there's parts of racism, marginalization, which is why I think this particular aspect is one thing that we really see, even though they're not fifth generation or multiple generation, even newcomers feel this aspect of this Madre. And finally, the final part, because land has been taken away and you have a spiritual connection to the land, there's this feeling that the culture is in prison because you can't express who you are, because you're disconnected from the land and from the culture. For political territories, similarly, these are kind of like, for example, I'm going to use Puerto Rico because it's the easiest to wrap your brain around. It's where most of the research happens. Again, this is a land of Latinos that have been taken over, and they are being told how to use their resources. So there's this aspect of loss of land and loss of power. There's resistance to it. One of the resistance that I loved reading about was fishermen or fishers. They would go out and they would fish and come back. They just feed enough for their family and maybe sell 1 or 2 fishes. And then they would misreport how much landings they actually had. And that was like, this is our land. Why are you telling me to come? Why are you people telling me what to do here on my land? And there was this whole aspect of that. And then the other aspect that's really starting to resonate from these political territories is this local ecological knowledge, which really talks about knowing the land in a very different way than I think scientists have been knowing, and really starting to document that and what they know about it. For the urban, these were the 4 continuing themes that we kept seeing, that I kept seeing across the way. Acculturation was a big part of it. How are people coming into these urban areas and how are they becoming part of that environment or not part of it? Access to green spaces. Honestly, this was the most interesting research, and I think has some really promising work coming out of the Chicago area, particularly because it's the way that Latinos are reacting to open spaces. So they'll go to a park, but they won't go during certain times of day because the perception of safety. So, they're like, well, you have access to park. Well, yeah, we can only go between 2 and 5 because after that, the gangs take over in the morning. It's the drug pushers, And so there's different things that are happening here that's really fascinating work. There's also aspects of how engaged we can get Latino movement or Latinos in the environmental justice aspect. And then another really new, interesting work is this cultural identity, tracing back the cultural identity through food. So people are like using food to help them connect back to their countries of origin. So for me, for example, we don't have tortillas in Colombia, we have arepas. And so trying to find the right type of maize to make those arepas was connecting me back to my cultural roots. So that's some really interesting work happening there. In the rural, we see mostly focused on agricultural workers and their issues. There's some real social injustices that are being done there, that are being explored, particularly on youth and youth of color, and how the abuse is happening. It's happening not only in their workplace, but in their homes and in their schools. And so there's some really interesting work being done in the rural communities. And finally, the non-peer review work is the work that of looking at Latino voting and how that they coincide with major issues, particularly like climate change or environmental issues. This is the kind of work, the people that I talk to that do this work, they are mostly in DC or in some large governmental agency, and the government saying, well, Latinos don't care about the environment. They're like, yeah, we do, and so they go and do tons of polls, and this is the type of work that falls under that. So what I realized that has happened is, we talk about diaspora. I mean, we know about diaspora of the Jewish people, we know the diaspora of the African community, but there's also been this diaspora of the Latino community. We have migrated from our countries of origin, our cultures of origin, have moved here, and then have been clumped all together under this social construct of Latino. And what that's created for us is this whole diaspora of thought. So Devon Pena talks a little bit about this weakening of scholarship, because what happens is when you start doing this research, whether it's agricultural or urban or in Puerto Rico, it's all siloed in these different areas, but they're not really talking to each other, seeing the common themes, but it's common social injustices. He also refers to there's no place to collect this information where we're like, this is Latino studies. And in fact, we've seen in recent history that there are states that have outlawed this type of ethnic study where we can coalesce this information. And so there's no place where we can come together and as a group of people, whether socially constructed or not, talk about how these injustices are happening to us no matter where we originally come from. And finally, the work is happening, and there's amazing work being done by great researchers across the country, but it's not really getting down to practice. So I think about like some of the work that they are doing with the open spaces in Chicago, and that could really be very beneficial for environmental educators. But that work isn't getting down to the practitioners. For the second part of my dissertation, I wanted to find out, well, what are the experiences that led someone like me and others like me to join the environmental movement? Are there similarities? Are there differences? And what are they? How did we develop this environmental identity? And again, I really wanted to use lab crit, and particularly I wanted to use these particular aspects of it to help me filter the ideas and the concepts there. I also used the work from significant life experiences, which is looking at these milestones that you can pinpoint to say that this was a very pivotal moment for me. I can remember this happening, and this is what triggered it, and this is how it connects to me now. And Tanner is one of the earlier researchers in this area, and he wanted to use significant life experiences, or SLEs, as a way to connect what environmentalists are doing and ways to motivate. If they did it this way, maybe we can motivate young people to do it as well. And so a lot of these SLEs are communicated through autobiographical narratives. And again, it's just important to note that this narrative is happening, situated between culture and society, and that's an important aspect to remember when people are telling their stories. I just wanted to show you this other work by Stex and Biga, looking at self-identity and environmental identity, and all the different identities, again, that intersect and go into play into creating an environmental identity and thus behavior. In order to capture some of this, I used concept mapping to help communicate some of these ideas back and forth with my participants and me, and try to capture some of the main SLEs or to get significant life experiences. So what I did was I interviewed 28 people. I started just putting it out there, people who would be willing to do it. By the time I got to participant 24, the same names kept coming up over and over and over, and I'm like, okay, I think I hit the core that people really want to talk to. So that was wonderful. Before I interviewed them, I sent them a prompt of what are the things, people's, places, experiences they think shape their environmental identity. And then, well, after the narrative, I asked them to please, I listed their experiences and asked them to rate them on a scale of 1 to 5 on how much they felt that particular item impacted their environmental identity. I then created a concept map, which, and I included codes in that concept map, which I then sent to the interviewee. And, excuse me, and during the second interview, we reviewed the concept maps, any changes or any additions that needed to happen happened at that point. If there were some significant changes, we corresponded back and forth via email. This was like, I have to say, this was probably the most exciting part of my research. I love this. People were seeing their concept maps for the first time, and they never had thought of themselves in quite that way. It was the first time for them to have critical self-reflection of themselves and their experiences, and that was lovely to be part of. So my participants ranged in ages and where they were born and what they preferred to speak in. Many of them, I had environmental economists, I had lawyers, I had people who had started their own nonprofits to environmental nonprofits, environmental educators, just people who were just beginning in the field and people who had been doing the work for 25 plus years. Media commentators, it was really a very fascinating group of people. So some of the main categories or SLEs that were mentioned are listed here. You'll note that there are more number than there are participants, and that's because many have mentioned it multiple times in their speaking about it. I color-coded this, and it's kind of hard to see, I realize now because of this, to show that some of these experiences were more significant in childhood, some were more significant, this one been more significant in their university years, and some were more significant in their adult life, or after they became professionals. So particularly for this group, family or having experiences in nature with family was a very important part of creating their environmental identity. But something I didn't expect was this whole aspect of mentorship and how much a job also helps cement that environmental identity. I just wanted to show the categories with the highest impacts. It didn't mean that necessarily they had the most mentions, but more importantly that these were the ones that had the highest correspondence to what was happening, what they felt was impactful. And I love that my husband got up and actually got food because that's the right Latino way to go. Way to go, me. That's why I married you. One of the other main findings that I found kind of interesting, Chawla is one of the main researchers in this, and she was talking about how people got into the environmental movement because they saw toxicity or they saw injustices being done upon another group. But for this audience, the injustices were happening to them. So it wasn't just like looking at someone in Africa, oh no, how horrible, let me spend money. It was like, no, the injustice is happening to me. And that was a really interesting experience. The other aspect that I also categorized as a negative experience was when they found incongruency with their home culture or with the culture that they were now embracing or the environmental movement. So these professionals, and I'll have to include myself included, often feel like the odd duck out. We don't feel completely in, in our home culture, but don't feel completely in also in the environmental movement. There's always just a little bit off, and you can't quite know how to feel completely in it. So I thought that was an interesting finding, again, that I didn't expect to find. Again, we saw from the significant learning experience or significant life experiences, family was a critical aspect of developing this environmental identity. The family aspect of it, or familismo, really extended about group activities. It's not just about your dad showing you how to do that. That wasn't it. It was more about going out and having that experience with your family in nature. And family wasn't just, for a lot of these environmental professionals, it wasn't just your biological family, it was also the family you adopted. So like I know I have family in this room, right? And they're not my biological family, but they're my family. And that's how a lot of these environmental professionals really felt about the people that they work with. Another really interesting aspect that I didn't know how to word it, but I finally came on it, was this aspect of consciencia social. And it's a Freudian concept to really think about how you are in relation to social justice in the environment. And for these individuals, there was really no separation of this. This was just part of who they were. Well, of course, I'm going to take care of the environment because that impacts your family. And it was just a natural part. Trying to tease it apart was even a little difficult. Trying to get them to really talk about it was a little bit difficult. And then they're like, oh yeah, I guess I do have social justice. But they didn't think about it as something really significant for them. Okay, and then finally, Can existing measures of environmental identity capture the Latino experience? Well, one of the questions that I kept hearing from these people that were running these big NGOs back in DC, and we keep getting questions over, are Latinos truly part of the environmental movement? Do they care about the environment? Well, I was like, they kept saying yes, because they got all these polls, but I wanted to try something a little bit different. So I used what's called an environmental identity scale. It was developed by this environmental psychologist, her name is Clayton. And this consisted of 24 statements. She actually was kind enough to give me an abbreviated version of the 11, which is very helpful because not only did I need to translate it, but often I had to read the questionnaire to some of my illiterate participants. So that was an important aspect of it. But it also has one of the strongest internal reliabilities across all the scales that have been shown. And it's also been administered across different countries. So I used this scale to see, well, do Latinos have a strong environmental identity? And in addition to that, I also added 4 statements to measure 2 of the cultural values that I found out of the interviews. So this is, Dr. Plaza was the one who put a lot of little, he's like, did you do this, did you do this? And so I kept going back to Dr. Plaza, did I do enough, did I do enough? And I have to say, Dr. Plaza, the one time I was most proud of myself was when I went to an ESL class in Tiger, and I had to sit there and read it to them, because they wanted me to read it to them in English, and then tell it to them in Spanish. and then when the Iranian student and the Chinese student heard what they were doing, they wanted to participate too. So I actually had their data as well. And they're really excited about it. But, so I reached out to very different audiences. I really wanted to make sure that I got, I of course did the social media network, and people were kind enough to, people as far as Alaska sent some of their information down. Church organizations, huge, I could not have done it without this Catholic organization, again in Tiger. Women's support groups, they were kind enough to let me come to their groups, college groups here, ESL classes. And out of 170 scales, 149 were used for analysis. And my husband helped me administer some of those things, he's good guy about that. So, and this is the breakdown of it. It's kind of hard to see, but and then this is the way I also used some of the analysis components of it. But what I want to show you is that we have a strong representation of people born in the US and a very strong representation of people not born here in this country, which I wanted to make sure was also a big part of that. And there were obviously a lot of males and females in this, but there was a good representation of different, really different Latino audiences. The main finding was, as far as this group is concerned, sure enough, they have a strong environmental identity. And interestingly enough, when compared to other audiences who have taken this EID, the longer EID, they actually have a higher mean than those audiences. The instrument itself proved good for the most part, with a couple exceptions of some key elements. In particular, there was a statement here, I would rather live in a small house, a small room or house with one view, with a nice view than a bigger room or a house with a view of other buildings. And particularly when we asked this question, when I administered this in person, people were like, why can't I have both? I don't understand why. I can have a big house and a big view. And I was like, oh. So there was a cultural context here that I think this was particularly asked when we were administering it in the large Catholic group. There were about 90 people there. I think people are coming for economic reasons, and they don't understand why there has to be a difference. Why can't I have the environment and a large house as well? Especially if you think about the familismo, a large house means you get a whole family in there versus a small house, I mean, granted, we have a saying in Spanish, de duerme uno, duerme dos, or de come uno, come dos, you close the door, everything becomes a bed, so, but bigger room is better. And then statistically significant findings. One of the main ones was this aspect that Latinos have a higher environmental identity than younger Latinos. Why is this the case? At this point, I can only speculate. But it is interesting that those that have been here longer maybe have stronger connections to their past, and maybe have a stronger environmental identity. So that kind of goes in with some of the other findings that people who are not born in this country have a higher affinity for experiencing nature with loved ones. and a desire to learn that about nature throughout their lives. And also, consistently, this also goes with another research that I found, people born in Latin America display a closer relationship to nature than mainstream US citizens. So there's some interesting findings here that I think can be explored even at a deeper level. So just to recap, because that was a lot of information and a lot of me talking at you, the main question I was trying to ask is, why are there not more people like me? What is the current, so that I started asking, what is the current research on Latinos and the environment? And I found out that sure enough, there actually is quite a lot of information. However, it's all spread apart in different silos, and they're not really connecting and talking to each other. And I don't know what's keeping them apart, but it's being kept apart. The second question I asked, what factors and experiences are common to those working in the environmental movement, and what plays a role in forming their environmental identity? And I found that family and feminismo were a really important aspect as far as also experiences in nature. I have to say, on a personal note, this experience in nature was a little disappointing for me, because I was really hoping to find people like me who didn't have a lot of experiences in nature as in my childhood, because this is happening in childhood. I was expecting to find more people like me. I found one other person like me. And so I think there's more to be rooted out, more like Latinos doing urban work, and see if did they have environmental experiences in nature, because I didn't. And but 27 of they all had experiences in nature, and they loved them. So these were the main significant life experiences. The third question is, can existing measures of environmental identity capture the Latino experience? And the answer is yes and no. We find that sure enough, if we compare the Latinos to others, we have a strong environmental identity, but there's still some cultural context within the scale that needs to be addressed. And I think that scale also needs to start addressing these other Latino values of feminismo. That is really something that we keep seeing repeated over and over again. So, what's the implication for us as social scientists and educators? I was thinking about this august body and trying to think, well, what could I inform you? I don't know. But I think for me, as I go out into the world and start really using some of this research, I have to find ways to really be able to capture these multiple identities. How do I do that? I mean, quantitative research does such a great job of finding these singular things and really trying to get at that. But how do I do that so that I can also get to feminismo, conciencia social, or get to the bicultural aspect of being a Latino environmentalist, which one person termed eco-mestiza, meaning that he's an ecologist, he's an environmentalist, but he's also mestiza. We're not full-blooded Indian or full-blooded Spaniard or full-blooded Black or full-blooded, we're a mixture, you know? And so how do I address this multidimensionality? We have to find new tools to be able to do that. The other aspect is there's these intersections that are really critical, that talk about power and privilege. How do I get to that? And how do we as a social scientists really try to understand and really categorize this in a different way? I'm still challenged with this. I think the Latino experience is very unique and dynamic. I think there's good work being done, but I think more work needs to be done in trying to find these areas. I think we're starting to see this more and more, the interdisciplinary aspect of people talking to each other. So in the Portland area, we are seeing more work with people like the people who plan all the buses and trains, with health organizations, with children in nature organizations. We need more of that work to intersect and overlap and do research together. So I think an implication is we need to start thinking about it rather than our siloed ways, in interdisciplinary ways that really address the issue. And when we finally get to some interesting research, we need to go back to the people doing the fieldwork and introduce that to them. And I'm sure, I have no doubt, that by going out into the field and seeing what they're doing, they will inform our practice, and then we come back, do new research, go back, re-inform. And I think this aspect of praxis is a really important part that is missing right now, and I think is the part that hasn't really activated the identity, environmental identity, as it should be by the environmental movement. So with all that fast talking, I appreciate your time. And are there any questions? I'm going to turn this off.
If you do have time for questions, so feel free from the audience.
Yes, fellow Latina.
I think I was that one person.
Your time.
That's a full disclosure. I did excellent survey. Thank you for the presentation, but not thank you for making me think more about my own research. Now I have to go back. Good thing. You answered one of my questions that I had about the tool, the measurement tools, right? And how measurement tools are there are appropriate or not for certain cultural groups. I saw that with my master's research in environmental literacy, where the national scale wasn't really appropriate to say that like a Midwesterner is environmentally literate or not, because it doesn't take into consideration their local issues or places they're coming from. And kind of see that the same way with the environmental identity scale. So I think a good thing coming out of your research is just another strengthening of this need of people to go back to those measurements and make it relevant and appropriate to specific groups and validate that, especially for Latinos. So my question is like kind of a little blurry. I don't even know how to ask that.
Go for it, girl.
But how I'm looking at conservation talk and conservation dialogue and family activities in museums. So would you say conservation identity would be a separate identity or within that environmental identity? How would you?
I'm sorry, repeat the last part.
I'm looking at all this research that say, okay, people that go to museums as a phrase and interact with live animals and develop some sort of conservation awareness,
Yeah.
right, action. And I'm trying to look at how do we create a rubric that really can tell us this counts as conservation dialogue is in a museum setting. So I don't know if you see that as a conservation identity kind of thing, or is that part of what you call environmental identity?
So the research itself would call any conservation behavior part of the environmental identity. However, there are people within the environmental identity research world that says if you're not doing action, you're not really an environmentalist. I'm on the other side of it, and I think Chala's on the other side of it too. Like, I think if you, sometimes by living the life that you are because of the access to power and privilege, you're limited in your environmental actions and behaviors, or what's deemed appropriate pro-environmental actions and behavior. So I remember one of the scales that I remember reading about was a study that was done across the world, and one of the questions was like, I take public transportation every day to get to work or school or whatever. Well, here in the U.S., that's a big deal. I mean, like, people are like, I'm green, I'm going to take my bus, or my bike, or take the bus. But if you live in South America, that's like an everyday occurrence. I mean, you can't get around without public transportation. So I'm like, so it's all about context, and I think we have to start broadening the idea and reopening how people are talking about it, and then how that impacts behavior. That's difficult though, because we've seen in museum studies that people say one thing one day, and 6 months later, they may or may not be identifying the same way they were 6 months. So I think you can only capture, crystallize one moment and how they perceive that, and then see if that happens in the future. Yes, Jen.
I have a question from a member of your Google Plus audience.
Thank you for being a moderator.
No problem. So it's from Michelle. So she was wondering about the 4 questions you added to the environmental identity scale, and so how did they score on those questions, and how did that compare to the rest of the scale, if you kind of analyze those separately at all?
So this was a great opportunity to learn on all the mistakes do when you make a scale. The 2 questions, one was on experiencing nature with family, and the second value was lifelong learning of nature. And the first one, I think I created questions that were very difficult to understand, and I think if I would have added a 3rd question rather than just 2, it would have been a more robust analysis of that. And I would say the same for the second value of lifelong learning. Lifelong learning, they scored off the charts. They wanted to learn the rest of their lives, which was again also a wonderful finding. All of the professionals and even the environmental identity scale, this concept of wanting to continually learn so goes against the grain of quote unquote lazy Latinos or lazy Mexicans, not that anyone here thinks it, but it has a stereotype, and so people are really countering that. They want to learn as much as they possibly can. So I think for the first part of family and nature, while many of them stated, I think I'd have to rework it and reword it and redo it in order for me to say, yes, this is definitely the case. That's just.
You started out by showing those graphs that were really easy to grasp about Latinos being very underrepresented of inside organizations for the environment, right? And then, if I understood it correctly, your findings ended up showing that actually Latinos have a much higher environmental identity and stronger environmental identity than mainstream America.
Correct.
So, did you
The research says.
Yeah. Did you discover anything then? I mean, it seems like the problem isn't that they don't have the identity or that they don't consider them so that an important issue. The problem must be somewhere in the organizations
In the
themselves.
environmental. Thank you for that question. I'm glad because I wanted to get to that question. So, yes, the issue really lies in the environmental movement and the way the environmental movement has not activated the environmental identity of Latinos. So, an example of that is I'm going to be working at a refuge in Tualatin, and the refuge has a limit of 10 people that can walk down the refuge at the same time. Now, my family, and my father's house, we had a party for just my family. There were 56 of us. My immediate family. I'm talking sisters, siblings, and their kids and their kids. Imagine, I'd be like, okay, mijo, only 10 of us are going to go. The rest of you guys are like, Well, if your aspect of familismo or your family is so important about being together, you already are contradicting that whole aspect of Latino values. So if you're saying, oh, well, that's not true environmental identity, because the only way to be there is to be gentle on this trail and to walk and quietly, then you've already removed this whole aspect of people interacting with nature in a very different way. So we in the environmental movement have to think of new ways of activating that identity that is that honors those cultural values, but is also respectful of what needs to happen in the environment. Yes, Les.
So I really like that you mentioned that you only found one other person that had their personal experience connected outside of the major environmental activity. I actually would hope that maybe when you have a chance to read, that you consider that as part of your research as well, for the future, especially with all the technology that's available and looking at what kids get to see and view today, especially within the community, because that actually I find very exciting and maybe to be hit on more, because it's so TV and electronic things that we all get to use in our hit with today. That is an aspect, and the same thing, just the answer that you just gave in terms of the philosophy is so different here in America in terms of what is green and what isn't green. So the ideas of what is environmentally acceptable and not is different, and maybe starting young and seeing how that is. I think that's a really important thing, to actually put some data-driven ideas out there in the literature on that would be great.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
And along with what Christy said, in the environmental organizations, in terms of them speaking more to the Latino community, in addition, do you think you could speak to how they could also bring in more in terms of the workforce? I know that my experience is that all they do is they say we need diverse candidates, but that's not enough. It doesn't seem to be enough to even have the person who's applying that could even potentially be in the organization.
One of the things that, for example, Green 2.0 pointed out, and this is something that I personally witnessed. They're like, they say, okay, we would like more people of color to come here, but these people, you have to have these experiences. You have to have intern for free, and make sure that I'm like, whoa, I can't do that. I have to work, make money somehow. So you have to intern for free, have these experiences, know how to dive, know how to hike, know how to make sure to set up camp. If you didn't grow up with any of that and you didn't have anyone to mentor you through that, then you're kind of lost, right? Or if you didn't have money, how are you gonna do all of those things? And so all of a sudden, you're at the beginning line and you're set back because you can't even apply for these jobs because you didn't even have those experiences. And then you get into the jobs and you're like, yes, I'm in the environmental field. What? The pay is what? And like I've explained to people, like those of us that come to college and are Latinos or ethnic minorities, because I've talked about it, it's not just me going to college, it's my family coming with me. You know, they're on my coattails. So when I finish my master's degree, my nephews back east, my nephews and nieces, they're like, oh, mi tía did that? I'm going to get a master's degree too. And they're waiting to hear about this PhD. Like, tia, I think I'm going to go get the PhD. So it's not just me. It's me coming and bringing them with me. So you have different barriers that happen. First, there's in getting into the whole thing. And then when you get there, you're like, okay, I guess I'll make it on the salary. That's fine. And then you get to the, well, you don't really have all the knowledge that we need for the environmental movement. I mean, in order for you to really stay here and make progress, you need to make sure you know this and this and this. Well, how am I supposed to get that? Well, you know, you go back and get your master's degree or your PhD. Okay, you know, so there's all these imperceptible barriers that continue to keep people from getting in, but also from moving up in the field. Yes.
I've been thinking about these issues of intersectionality and the way that you were just talking about the privilege that goes along with those kind of environmental experiences. And so I was wondering about the types of family experiences that you saw, and I was thinking about how, you know, raising a vegetable garden is a very different formative experience than going to the zoo and seeing the penguins.
Right.
And those seem like those would both be included in that like family environment category, but they bring with them such different issues of privileging. I was wondering if you tease those apart within your data.
I did. I kind of lumped them together because as we've seen that there's a pan-ethnicity created under this social construct of Latino, the same goes for the experiences. And I put them together as more under this emotional vein of what it meant to the family experience. So I'll give you an example. One of my people, she had been in radio for a very long time, and then after she retired from radio, she decided she wanted to do something in the environmental movement. And when you talk about her environmental movement, she talks about growing things. But she's like, it's not just the growing of Jen. It's about taking the food and then putting it on the plate, cooking it with your abuela and your mom, and you're talking story about how things happen. And then you sit down with the tios and los primos and you eat it. That is the whole experience. That's very different than when you talk about, you know, environmental experiences in gardening. It wasn't this full breadth of things. And so that's why I needed to add the term familismo, because it was a real connection. It wasn't just the one experience. It was going out to the zoo, for example, and the mom would be like, look at those little penguins. See how that little penguin follows the other penguin? You have to follow me just like that little penguin, because that's how moms and little kids do it. You know? And I heard that over and over again, how they use. So it was moving, just not talking about the natural science, but talking about the family, constantly keeping the family together. So it wasn't a splitting, it was more like a lumping for me because of that aspect of it.
Great. One more question, Teresa?
I don't know that you mentioned it, but in your participants and the way they answered the identity scale, did you see any differences based on their location, if they came from a location, say, that had like a higher incidence of natural disasters like tornadoes or floods or anything like that, where nature's kind of more apparent or obvious?
I'll look at that specifically. I didn't get down to that grain as far as asking how many experiences. I asked them where they were born, so they gave me like their country of origin. But no one ever, like some of them like said, oh, I was born in Colima, Mexico, but they never said, I didn't ask for that grain. That was one of the things that I kind of wrestled with on that environmental identity scale. I was really grateful for Dr. Clayton giving me the shorter scale, because I was able to administer to audiences that wouldn't typically get that scale. The research on the environmental scale is always given to college students. That's who, of course, these professors have access to. But the fact that I sat there and talked to people and read the scale to them was such a very different experience. And I was grateful that she did give me the smaller scale, in order for me to be able to capture that voice. But I think that there's ways that we could do it better. So capturing that brain would be wonderful, but a longer version of that would have, be very permanent. It wouldn't have allowed me to really get to that particular audience. And so.
I think it's very kind to say that's the only audience they have access to. It's the only audience they access. It can't be undergraduate audience. Great, thank you all very much. Thank you, Jenny, again. Great questions. We will take 5 minutes for you to say something to Jenny to get more food, and then we'll ask everybody who's not part of the committee to leave the room. Thank you.
Thank you.